I'm sorry, sir. This funeral is a restricted event. We need an invitation or official permission.
I fought with General.
Guards refused the old man at the general's funeral until a four-star general halted everything. When John Miller shuffled toward General Wallace's funeral at Arlington in worn shoes and a threadbare suit, young guards blocked his path as inappropriate for military ceremony. They had no idea they were stopping a legend who'd saved more soldiers than anyone alive. Arlington National Cemetery stretched endlessly under November's gray sky, its white headstones standing at perfect attention like an army of marble soldiers. The funeral pavilion buzzed with military precision, dress blues arranged in formation, ribbons and medals catching weak autumn sunlight, the quiet murmur of high-ranking officers sharing war stories in measured tones. American flags rippled in cold wind that carried the weight of sacrifice, where heroes slept beneath manicured grass and legends gathered to honor their own. John Miller approached the ceremony with the careful gait of someone whose knees remembered too many forced marches and jungle ambushes. At 78, he wore a suit purchased decades ago that hung loose on a frame diminished by age and memories. His shoes resoled so many times, the leather bore the geography of 1,000 difficult miles. What the gathering military elite couldn't see were battles etched into his weathered hands. 18 months as a forward observer in Vietnam, countless nights calling in artillery strikes that saved American lives, and a reputation among special forces units that bordered on mythical. The Shepherd wasn't just his call sign, it was whispered in veteran circles from Fort Bragg to Da Nang, spoken with the reverence reserved for men who brought soldiers home when hope was lost. But John Miller, retired postal worker, was fighting to honor a fallen friend while carrying classified heroism that most would never understand. His challenge wasn't financial. Military pension provided modest stability. His battle was recognition. How do you honor fallen comrades when your greatest accomplishments remain classified? How do you belong at military ceremonies when age has stripped away the physical markers of service? He was fighting to pay respects while carrying invisible valor that younger soldiers couldn't recognize. The confrontation began at the security checkpoint, where Sergeant Martinez and Corporal Thompson, both fresh from ceremonial guard training, assessed John through the lens of military standards they'd memorized but never truly understood. "Sir, I'm sorry, but this is a restricted military funeral," Sergeant Martinez said with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned orders. "Only family members and invited guests with proper documentation." John reached into his jacket pocket with movements careful enough to avoid triggering security responses, producing a worn business card from his postal service days alongside a faded photograph of himself in jungle fatigues standing beside a much younger General Wallace. "I served with him in Vietnam," John said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of shared foxholes and midnight artillery missions. "He saved my life at Firebase Alpha. I came to pay my respects." Corporal Thompson barely glanced at the photograph, dismissing it with the arrogance of youth judging age. "Sir, anyone could have old photos. We need official invitation or family verification." John's strategy was pure veteran diplomacy. Remain calm, follow proper channels, trust that military brotherhood would ultimately prevail. He'd navigated more dangerous territories than bureaucratic obstruction jungle patrols, where mistakes meant death had taught him patience under pressure. "Could you contact Colonel Hayes?" John asked reasonably. "He's handling ceremony coordination. He'll vouch for my relationship with the general." But the young guards saw only an elderly man in shabby clothing disrupting their perfect military pageant. Martinez exchanged glances with Thompson, both interpreting John's persistence as either confusion or deliberate trespassing, rather than legitimate grief seeking expression. "Sir, we can't disturb senior officers for every person claiming military connections," Thompson said with barely concealed irritation. "Perhaps you could watch from the public area outside the cemetery." The suggestion hung between them like smoke from distant artillery. John had faced enemy fire with less emotional impact than this casual dismissal of his service and sacrifice. John made his first direct appeal to military tradition. "Gentlemen, I understand your position, but I've traveled from Ohio specifically for this ceremony. General Wallace and I served together in the 1st Infantry Division. We were brothers in arms." "Everyone claims military service these days," Martinez replied, his tone suggesting John was just another homeless veteran spinning stories for sympathy. "We see this every week, people trying to get into restricted ceremonies with fabricated connections." The accusation hit John like shrapnel from a forgotten war. He'd spent 50 years carrying classified memories of men saved and missions accomplished, only to be dismissed as a fraud by soldiers young enough to be his grandchildren. "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about," he said quietly, more to himself than to them, watching distinguished officers file past the checkpoint with automatic deference while his authentic grief was questioned and rejected. The ceremony was beginning, and John Miller the shepherd remained on the wrong side of military protocol. John's second approach focused on specific military details that couldn't be fabricated. "Sergeant, General Wallace earned his Silver Star at Firebase Charlie in May of '69. I was the forward observer who called in the artillery that broke the NVA assault. I can give you coordinates, radio frequencies, casualty numbers, details that aren't in any public records." Martinez remained unmoved, interpreting detailed knowledge as evidence of obsessive research rather than authentic experience. "Sir, with the internet, anyone can find military information. We need official documentation, not war stories." Thompson nodded agreement, both guards now viewing John as a potential security threat rather than a grieving veteran. Their training emphasized threat assessment and crowd control, not empathy or historical recognition of service. But Captain Sarah Hayes, passing nearby while coordinating ceremony logistics, caught fragments of John's detailed recounting and paused. Something about his voice, his precise military terminology, triggered recognition she couldn't quite place. "Vietnam, 1969?" she asked quietly, approaching with curiosity rather than suspicion. "Yes, ma'am," John replied, recognizing officer rank and responding with ingrained military courtesy. "1st Infantry Division, forward observer attached to Special Forces units. Served with then Captain Wallace on multiple operations." Captain Hayes studied John more carefully, noting details the guards had missed. Perfect posture despite age, hands that moved with the economy of someone trained in weapon handling, eyes that tracked personnel and terrain with the automatic situational awareness of combat veterans. "What was your call sign?" she asked, testing knowledge that couldn't be researched online. "The Shepherd," John answered simply, not realizing he'd just identified himself to someone who had studied Vietnam War history extensively as part of her military education. Captain Hayes felt recognition hit like lightning. Every officer familiar with Special Forces history knew about the Shepherd, the forward observer, who'd earned legendary status by guiding lost patrols home and calling in artillery support that saved countless American lives. The guards watched this exchange with growing confusion, unsure why a captain would show interest in their troublesome trespasser. "Gentlemen," Captain Hayes said to the guards, her voice carrying new authority, "I need you to step back. This man is not trespassing." "But ma'am," Sergeant Martinez protested, "he has no official invitation or documentation." "He has something better," Hayes replied, studying John with the respect reserved for living legends. "He has the kind of service record that earned General Wallace's lifelong gratitude and brotherhood." The ceremony had begun without John. Distinguished officers and military elite gathered to honor General Wallace, while his most significant battle companion remained excluded by bureaucratic obstruction. Through the pavilion openings, John could see the flag-draped coffin, honor guards standing at attention, mourners who'd known the general through peacetime assignments rather than wartime brotherhood. "Ma'am," John said quietly to Captain Hayes, "I don't want to cause problems. I just wanted to say goodbye to an old friend who saved my life more than once." Captain Hayes made a decision that would transform the entire ceremony's meaning. "Sir, you're not causing problems. You're being denied your rightful place among those honoring a fallen comrade." She turned to the guards with crisp authority. "Sergeant Martinez, Corporal Thompson, you're about to receive an education in military history that wasn't covered in your training manuals." As she began explaining the Shepherd's legendary status, a black sedan arrived carrying General Robert Peters, 4 stars gleaming on his dress blues. He stepped out with the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority, his presence immediately commanding attention from everyone within sight. But it was John who caught his attention first, not the gathered officers or ceremony preparations, but the elderly man in the threadbare suit standing beside Captain Hayes with the unmistakable bearing of a warrior. General Peters' expression changed as recognition dawned, his eyes widening with the same shock that would soon ripple through the entire military gathering. General Peters crossed the distance between his sedan and the security checkpoint with purposeful strides that made every soldier straighten reflexively. His 4 stars represented authority that could end careers with a word, and his expression suggested serious displeasure with what he was witnessing. "What exactly is happening here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the command authority that had shaped military policy for decades. Sergeant Martinez snapped to attention, panic evident as he realized their insignificant trespasser situation had somehow escalated to involve the most senior officer present. "Sir, we have an unauthorized individual attempting to gain access to the restricted ceremony. He claims military service but lacks proper documentation." General Peters studied John with the analytical precision that had made him legendary in military strategic planning. Something about the elderly man's bearing, his particular way of standing at modified attention despite civilian clothes, triggered memories of classified briefings and Special Forces legends. "State your name and unit," General Peters commanded, addressing John directly. "John Miller, sir," John replied with crisp military courtesy that hadn't faded despite decades of civilian life. "Forward observer, 1st Infantry Division, attached to various Special Forces units, Vietnam 1968 to 1970. General Peters' expression transformed completely as understanding detonated through his consciousness like artillery impact. "Call sign?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "The Shepherd," John replied simply, unaware that he'd just identified himself to someone who'd studied his classified achievements for military history research. The silence that followed was profound and electric. General Peters had spent years researching Vietnam War heroes for strategic doctrine development, and the Shepherd's legend was taught in advanced military academies as an example of individual initiative under fire that changed operational outcomes. "Gentlemen," General Peters said to the guards, his voice now carrying the weight of historical revelation, "you have just attempted to deny cemetery access to one of the most decorated soldiers in American military history." Sergeant Martinez felt his career prospects evaporating as he realized the magnitude of their error. Corporal Thompson's face went white as he understood they'd been questioning a living legend. "Sir," Martinez stammered, "we had no way to know." "You had every way to know," General Peters cut him off sharply. "Military bearing, precision in speech, specific knowledge of classified operations, and the respect to present himself properly at a fallen comrade's funeral. You failed to recognize character because you were looking for paperwork." General Peters turned to address John directly, his demeanor shifting from commanding authority to profound respect. "Mr. Miller, on behalf of the United States Army, I apologize for this unconscionable treatment. You should have been seated in the front row an hour ago." "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about," John said quietly, looking at the young guards with understanding rather than anger. These soldiers were following their training. They weren't trying to dishonor service, they were trying to protect it. The grace John showed in the face of humiliation and exclusion was witnessed by gathering military personnel who'd been drawn by the confrontation. Word was spreading through the ceremony that the Shepherd himself had been turned away from General Wallace's funeral, and that a 4-star general had intervened to correct an injustice that revealed systemic failures in how the military honored its own heroes. The ceremony was about to become something much more significant than a funeral. It was about to become a lesson in recognition, respect, and the invisible battles that true warriors fight. General Peters escorted John personally toward the ceremony pavilion, his 4 stars serving as an unmistakable signal to every officer and soldier that the elderly man beside him deserved their highest respect. As they walked, news of the Shepherd's identity rippled through the gathering like shock waves from a distant explosion. "Sir," John said quietly, "I don't need special treatment. I just wanted to pay my respects to a man who saved my life and the lives of countless others." "Mr. Miller," General Peters replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood military history's true weight, "you're about to receive the recognition that should have been yours all along, and every soldier here is about to learn what real heroism looks like." The ceremony was about to become a masterclass in honor, sacrifice, and the invisible battles that created legends. As General Peters and John approached the pavilion, conversation stopped and heads turned. Distinguished officers, military elite, and political figures who'd come to honor General Wallace suddenly found themselves witnessing something unprecedented: a 4-star general personally escorting someone who'd been excluded from the ceremony. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Peters announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent gathering, "I want you to meet John Miller, better known in military circles as the Shepherd. He served with General Wallace in Vietnam and saved more American lives than most of us will ever know." The impact was immediate and profound. Officers who'd studied military history felt recognition hit like lightning. Veterans who'd heard whispered stories in VFW halls suddenly understood they were in the presence of living legend. "The Shepherd," General Peters continued, "called in artillery support that saved General Wallace's unit at Firebase Charlie in 1969. He guided lost patrols home through hostile territory, coordinated medical evacuations under fire, and performed acts of heroism that remain classified to this day." John stood quietly beside the general, uncomfortable with public attention, but understanding that this moment transcended personal preference. He was representing not just his own service, but the thousands of soldiers whose heroism went unrecognized because it happened in shadows and silence. Sergeant Martinez and Corporal Thompson watched from the security checkpoint, finally comprehending the magnitude of their failure. They'd questioned the credentials of someone whose achievements formed the foundation of their own military training. "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about," General Peters said, echoing John's earlier words. "And Mr. Miller has been fighting those battles with quiet dignity for 50 years. Today, we correct an injustice and honor not just General Wallace, but the brother who stood beside him when it mattered most." The ceremony that followed became legendary in military circles, not just for honoring General Wallace, but for demonstrating how recognition and respect should transcend appearance, age, and bureaucratic protocol. John was seated beside General Wallace's family, where he belonged, where he should have been from the beginning. During the service, John shared stories that weren't in any official records, moments of brotherhood, sacrifice, and courage that existed only in the memories of those who lived them. As the ceremony concluded and taps echoed across Arlington's sacred ground, General Peters made one final announcement. Effective immediately, all military personnel will receive training in recognizing service that transcends documentation. We will never again fail to honor our heroes because we're looking for paperwork instead of character. John accepted the condolences and recognition with characteristic humility, but the impact rippled far beyond one ceremony. Video of the event, captured by attendees, would spread through military communities worldwide, becoming a teaching tool about respect, recognition, and the invisible battles that true warriors fight. The Shepherd had been found, recognized, and honored not just by high-ranking officials, but by a military community that learned something profound about what it means to truly see and value service. As mourners departed, Sergeant Martinez approached John with tears in his eyes. "Sir, I owe you an apology that can never be adequate. We dishonored your service through our ignorance." "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about," John replied with the same gentleness he'd shown throughout their confrontation. "You were doing your job as you understood it. Now you understand it better. That's what matters." Captain Hayes ensured John received copies of all ceremony programs and photographs, while General Peters personally drove him to the airport, continuing conversations about classified operations that most Americans would never know happened. Months later, Martinez would volunteer at Veteran Support Services, finally understanding that heroism often wore civilian clothes and carried invisible wounds. The incident became required training for all ceremonial guards, teaching them to recognize character over credentials. And John would receive a steady stream of letters from soldiers who'd learned his story, thanking him not just for his service, but for teaching them about grace under fire. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones fighting battles in silence, carrying classified courage while wearing threadbare suits to honor fallen friends. The strongest people are usually fighting battles you know nothing about, and sometimes those battles were fought in Vietnamese jungles, calling in artillery strikes that saved American lives, by heroes who return home to face bureaucracy with the same quiet courage they once showed under enemy fire. And so